my theory of things is I try to do a bunch of science, and I spend lots of time building tools that let lots of people do science, but I view myself as sort of sample user number one or something. And I've been able to do, well, lots of exciting science with the technology we built. And I guess one thing that's been happening recently, our physics project, which kind of I started in the early 1990s, but really got launched in 2019 and sort of got announced in 2020. It's been going, I would say, the core concepts of it have been going fantastically well. I'm a little frustrated that we're not further along in kind of being able to connect sort of the low-level machine code that we seem to have figured out for how physics works with kind of the higher level sorts of things you can actually observe in astrophysics and cosmology and quantum processes and so on. We know how to connect theory to theory, so to speak, our low-level machine code to general relativity, to quantum mechanics, to some quantum field theory, to some quantum gravity and so on. But what I really want to do is to find effects where it's kind of like you finally get to see the evidence of the discreteness of space and so on. I mean, it's kind of, you know, the history is sort of people imagined that everything might be discrete back in antiquity. And then by the end of the 1800s, finally, people knew matter was discrete. At the time, most physicists assumed that space was discrete, but nobody could figure out kind of how to make that work with relativity and things like that. I think we finally know how that works. And the question is, can we tell that space is discrete? People were lucky at the beginning of the 20th century that molecules were sort of big enough that things like Brownian motion turned out to sort of reveal their presence. And the question now is, in terms of experimental implications, might we be lucky, or are we off by a few hundred years in being able to find evidence of the discreteness of space? And so one of the projects I'm embarking on now, a little bit postponed, is sort of to explore all the different areas of physics and all those weird effects. Like Brownian motion was known from the 1830s, but nobody had interpreted it as, you know, grains or little things from pollen grains being kicked by water molecules. And so the question is, are there things lurking in the existing experimental literature that are already evidence of the discreteness of space? And can we make those connections? That's one thing I'm interested in. Another thing that has been kind of a big thing for us is this whole idea of multicomputation, this whole concept of the Roolead, this sort of idea of this entangled limit of all possible computations, and kind of the realization that something that I would never have guessed. If you'd asked me about this 10 years ago, or when I was in the middle of doing particle physics and cosmology back in the late 1970s, I would have said, that's completely crazy, that will never work. The question is, can you derive the laws of physics? And I don't mean just find what the laws of physics happen to be in the universe. I mean, find a way to actually go from something else to a derivation that these have to be the laws of physics. And it's something where, you know, been interested for more than 50 years in the second law of thermodynamics, which is a place where you do get the idea. People thought from the 1860s on, this is something we can derive. We know mechanics, we should be able to derive the second law. It's not something that is it's not something that we have to kind of wheel in, it's something that is derivable. I finally think I understand, kind of 50 years after I started thinking about it, how one derives the second law. And it turns out that it seems that general relativity and quantum mechanics are similarly derivable. And the story ends up being kind of this interplay between this computational irreducibility of underlying processes and our nature as observers of those things. So for example, second law of thermodynamics, kind of the big question is, you've got all these molecules bouncing around, and in principle, you can make measurements or prepare states where you would see non-thermodynamic behavior happening. But in practice, you can't do that. Why not? Well, you can't do it because the process of these molecules bouncing around is computationally irreducible. By that, I mean, it's kind of a concept that I invented 40 years ago now, which is this idea of there are processes that where you know the rules, you can go, step by step with the rules, but there is no way to kind of jump ahead. There's no way to kind of get the exact solution, figure out what will happen, a million steps from now without basically running those million steps and seeing what happens. And so that's computational irreducibility, which is kind of denies the possibility of easy predictability. And it's something that shows up in just a whole bunch of areas, whether it's sort of computational, whether it's in physics, whether it's in thinking about how AIs work, and so on. So the thing that has been so this sort of underlying computational irreducibility of something like molecules bouncing around, you can't figure out. It's as if you start off with the initial conditions, and then there's this computational irreducibility that effectively encrypts those initial conditions. And then the question is, for an observer like us, can we decrypt the encryption associated with that computational irreducibility? And the big point is that observers like us are computationally bounded. We have finite minds. We don't get to run arbitrary, irreducible computations. And so the second law is kind of the result of the interplay between our computational boundedness as observers and the underlying computational irreducibility of the system that we're observing. And that interplay allows one to derive the second law for observers like us. If we were not observers like us, if we were observers who could do much more computation, then we wouldn't believe in the second law. But for observers like us, you get to derive the second law. And the big surprise is the same thing is true, it seems, with general relativity and with quantum mechanics. Both of them can be thought of as features of this Roolead object, this entangled limit of all possible computations, a kind of slice through that as sampled by observers like us. And so there's sort of a whole story here of how that works and how we represent the sort of computations in this Roolead in terms of hypergraph rewriting. It's probably not the only way to do it, but is the least humanly obscure way to do it. I mean, in a sense, whenever you make models in science, you're trying to make this bridge between what nature actually does and what we get to understand about what nature does. And in this case, hypergraph rewriting is kind of the most flexible sort of underlying model that lets one understand that. It's probably not the only way to represent the kind of computational processes that are going on. But anyway, so the big excitement for me has been the fact that one can sort of derive these laws of physics from the fact that we are observers of the kind we are, that we have certain characteristics. We can derive these facts, and we can't derive everything. We can derive that Einstein's equations apply. We cannot derive that there should be 3 dimensions of space, or at least approximately 3 dimensions of space, because in our models, dimension is a dynamical parameter. So we can expect dimension fluctuations in the universe. That's one of the things we can expect to look for astrophysically. And that's its whole interesting story, because as soon as you have dimension fluctuations, dimension variation, you are out of the game of differential geometry as it's been constructed so far. It's like, what's the Riemann tensor in 3.1 dimensions and so on? We don't know. We are trying to, one of our projects is to construct what we call infrageometry, which is geometry where you're starting not from a manifold, where ultimately you're dealing with Euclidean patches of Euclidean space, but rather from a hypergraph, from the limit of a hypergraph, what is the kind of effective geometry that you can construct from that? And we sort of have to reconstruct geometry on that basis. So in any case, this whole Roolead idea and the whole idea of multicomputation, these many threads of history, branching and merging and so on, lots of applications of that. The things that, I've been interested in recently, well, one is to metamathematics, the foundations of mathematics. Here's a fun fact that if you think about the limit of mathematics, so in mathematics as we have practiced it over the last couple of millennia, there are 3 or 4 million theorems that people have published in the literature of mathematics. What's the limit of an infinite number of theorems? Well, the theorems that we've got, we can think of as forming this kind of network of from 2 theorems, we can derive another theorem and so on. We keep doing that. And that process builds up this giant network. And the notable theorems of mathematics lie in particular points in this big network. But we can ask questions like, this network should also be a slice of this Roolead object. And we can ask, what can we say what are the laws of mathematics that are analogous to the laws of physics? And I think the most important law of mathematics is that higher level mathematics is possible, which is not obvious. It's the same question as, is fluid dynamics possible? It could be the case that if you want to study sort of a fluid, that you were out of luck because you had to study those individual molecules all bouncing around, and that there's no higher level description of sort of fluid flow and Navier-Stokes equations and things like this, that everything has to be molecular dynamics. It's a non-trivial fact that fluid dynamics is possible. And that fact is related to the second law and things like this. But that's sort of that there is a way of describing fluid dynamics at the fluid dynamics level rather than having to drop down to the molecular dynamics level. So the same question can be asked of mathematics. If you formalize mathematics, as one does, in a proof-assistant system or something like that, you say, let me talk about the Pythagorean theorem. Well, you don't get to talk about the Pythagorean theorem. You have to sort of drop down to this kind of axiomatic layer, and I think it's 8,000 lemmas or something to get from the axiomatic foundations in set theory up to the Pythagorean theorem. And it could be the case that every time you want to say something about triangles, right triangles, that you have to drop down to the kind of molecular dynamics level of figuring out, what's the definition of reals and things like this. But that isn't in fact true. In fact, we get to do mathematics at the level where we can just talk about the Pythagorean theorem without having to always drop down to this sort of underlying axiomatic level. And that's analogous to the fact that we can do fluid dynamics at the fluid dynamics level without having to drop down to molecular dynamics. Occasionally, we do have to drop down to molecular dynamics. If we're doing, I don't know, something like, hypersonic flow, we might have to drop down and know there are molecules, but most of the time we don't. And so the fact that higher level mathematics is possible is one big result of mathematics. Another result, I think is kind of interesting, is homogeneity of space, physical. So this is saying that the existence of physical space, the existence of fluids to observers like us is analogous to the existence of higher level mathematics to mathematical observers like us. And the thing that in space, one of the notable features is that space is fairly homogeneous. There is a possibility of pure motion. You can take a thing and expect to move it from one place in space to another and have it still be the same thing. Obviously, even in traditional general relativity, if you're near enough to a space-time singularity, that won't be true of any object. But in a first approximation, you can kind of move around in space and there is a notion of pure motion. So in mathematics, what's the analog of pure motion in metamathematical space? The answer is a different point in metamathematical space. One might be algebra, one might be geometry. The idea of pure motion is the idea of essentially dualities between different fields of mathematics. So it's kind of a way of understanding that in a sort of geometrical type way. And there are lots of wonderful things. I mean, there are analogies between, for example, black holes in physical space are places, well, at least in a simplest Schwarzschild black hole or whatever, all JD6 end in finite time. Effectively, time ends. In our model of physics, it's very, very direct. You have this rewriting of a hypergraph, and at the center of a black hole, time simply stops. There are no more rewrites that can be applied. It's an incredibly direct, almost mechanical interpretation of what's going on. You don't have to worry about manifolds and poking holes in manifolds and so on, because in discrete space-time, there aren't those kinds of issues. But in any case, in space-time, there are black holes where time ends. In mathematics, there are decidable theories where all proofs are of bounded length, effectively. And so in undecidability, in metamathematics, is like the possibility of infinite JD6 in physical space. So black holes are like decidable theories. Black holes in physical space are like decidable theories in mathematics. Lots of lovely things like this. In any case, recently I've been looking a bit at some other fields, and particularly biology. I made kind of a surprising piece of progress that I should have made in the 1980s and just didn't have quite the right intuition of understanding sort of an underlying computational theory of biological evolution that kind of explains why biological evolution works and gives you a sense of kind of how different ideas get generated in different parts of a sort of tree of life and how that works. Turns out the same methods can be used to understand machine learning. One of the challenges of machine learning is, why does it work? Why is it possible, if you bash a neural net hard enough, to get it to learn stuff? It wasn't obvious until 2011 that would work at all. It's a surprising thing that it works. Why does it work? Turns out that one can understand that, and it's sort of a story of computational irreducibility again, and kind of the picture of what is machine learning doing? What is biological evolution doing? What it's doing is, instead of building things which are like an engineer would build, where there's kind of mechanisms that you can see, instead of doing that, you're going out into the computational universe. You're finding this lump of computational irreducibility, and you're essentially gluing together lumps of computational irreducibility. That's what biology does. It finds these bizarrely different mechanisms to achieve particular objectives. It kind of glues these together, and if you look at each one, it's hard to understand. It's hard to understand why you would come up with that one, but it's one that happens to work. Machine learning, it seems, works the same way. And my kind of analogy for this is, you're trying to build a wall. Well, you can build a wall out of bricks. You engineer each brick. You lay the bricks down in a bricklayer pattern, and you understand how the wall is built. The alternative is, you're building a wall out of rocks, and you pick up one stone from here, one stone from there. You make this stone wall, and the rocks fit together, but it's kind of a random pattern that you get. And this is something where you're kind of, if you ask, well, why is the stone wall the way the stone wall is? The answer will be, there isn't really an answer. It's just, well, because I happen to see that rock lying around on the ground. And that's what machine learning is doing. That's what biological evolution is doing. It means that there is much that happens in machine learning that isn't really explainable. It's just those rocks happen to fit together that way. And in fact, the things I found, some ways of thinking about machine learning that are a bit simpler than what one has to do with neural nets, and that has some practical importance in actual hardware for machine learning and things like this. Anyway, I yacked on for ages here. I was meaning to just say things for 1 minute or so, but it's hard to compress. I'm realizing that I am not set up. Let's see. I could probably, just to give you some sense of what the heck I'm talking about here. Let me see. All right. So this is my kind of what I do all day type summary. That was from today. This is sort of interesting. This was a recent. Can you see this? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
This was the thing I wrote a couple of weeks or two ago. This is about formalized mathematics. 25 years ago, I found the simplest axiom for Boolean algebra, and I found it by automated theorem proving. And there's the axiom. It's really tiny, but there's the proof. It's really huge. And so this was an attempt to explore kind of an example of formalized mathematics, this proof. How can one understand that proof? And this is kind of like lemmas on the way to that proof. This is kind of some of the lemma structure of that proof, the relationship between lemmas. We can kind of keep going down and try to understand. Well, it's all rather complicated, unfortunately, but this is the way that one can combine axioms. Axiom combines with an event that produces another theorem. This is very similar to the way that space-time works in our models of having these hyperedges combine to make other hyperedges in a hypergraph through these events. And this is, but you can kind of build this up, and you can see how different theorems get built up here. And somewhere here, I probably have how this, well, this is the proof from an intermediate lemma of A dot B equals B dot A for Boolean algebra. And it's kind of fun to see perhaps how, inside this proof, this was an automated proof. This is kind of a, people say, well, we're going to make proof assistants and they're going to prove all kinds of things in mathematics automatically. And it's like, well, what you're going to get is something like, if you succeed, you're going to get something like this. This, I think, is the only example of an interesting theorem found in mathematics by automated theorem proving. Most things in automated theorem proving are proving things we already knew were true. And so this is kind of an exploration of what was actually involved in the innards of that automated proof And you can kind of see somewhere here, I've got, yeah, if you unroll that proof without using lemmas, it takes like 85,000 steps, 83,000 steps. And you can do things like, what are the most popular lemmas? Can you try and deduce, what would be a better notation? Anyway, that was a thing I was doing a couple of weeks ago. Then, well, this is about biological evolution, just to say something about that. This is a very minimal model. So that's a genome, that's a critter. Critter starts from a little seed up here, follows these rules, and in this particular case, dies out after a little while. What you're doing is then mutating that genome by making single point mutations to the outcome from these rules. And then you ask, can you make a critter that will live as long as possible, but not infinitely long? And so you get this kind of path of adaptive evolution. This is one path of possible adaptive evolution leading to that critter. This is now different paths, just different rolls of the dice leading to different critters, so to speak. And what you see is these different critters, in effect, have different ideas for how to live a long time. It's kind of interesting to see that and compare that with what you see in biological life of these different trees, branches in the tree of life, and there's sort of different ideas for how to live a long time. Here are some other examples. What you can do, that's kind of a loss curve or fitness curve of showing how, as it adaptively evolves, how it achieves higher and higher fitness and occasionally makes a breakthrough and usually is not being as that successful in achieving higher fitness. Well, then the thing you can do, because there's a very simple model, you can look at all possible mutations. This is a multi-way graph that shows all possible mutation paths for this very simplified organism. And this kind of shows this is one branch in the tree of life, that's another branch, different ideas for how to live a long time. And needless to say, well, you can do all kinds of analysis on these things. And you can start asking for different kinds of fitness functions. And what you discover is that biological evolution, you can think of in terms of this multi-way graph, different fitness functions correspond to different foliations of this multi-way graph. It's like having space-time and having different reference frames, different choices of space-like hypersurfaces. Actually, here it's different choices of branch-like hypersurfaces in branchial space, and those correspond to different fitness functions. So effectively, you've got this one fixed multi-way system, and with different choices of what's important for an organism, you are sort of sampling that multi-way system in different ways. So for instance, well, there's a much bigger multi-way system that, but you can see somewhere here, I think I have some examples of kind of sampling the space. Well, there's a weird little piece of megafauna that shows up somewhere in the space of these are different fitness criteria. But let me show you something here, maybe one last example for this. Where is it? Yeah, well, lots of stuff. This is what you get to do with the tools that I spent the last 40 years building, is you can create stuff like this comparatively quickly. Once you understand the science, the actual mechanics of figuring stuff out is quite quick, even though my general mantra is the computational animals are always smarter than we are, in the sense that when you think you know what will happen, you actually run the experiment and something bizarre and different happens. But let's see, I think I have an example here. Yeah, this is what happens if you choose different fitness functions. This is showing the different successes and failures of different organisms. So this is effectively taking different reference frames, sampling the multi-way system in different ways with different fitness functions. This is with one fitness function, that guy in early parts of geological time, so to speak, that guy is doing well and then it does less well, that guy is winning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're seeing how, in some of these cases, we're seeing how changes in fitness functions, well, I think this is just evolution with one fitness function. Here we can see, where is it? We can see kind of what happens with changes in fitness functions. If there's an ice age, what happens? And you can see this in a very explicit model where you can explicitly see these different sort of idealized organisms. Anyway, lots of, I wrote a thing about nature of time here. This is what I was talking about with machine learning. This is sort of traditional machine learning. You have a neural net, you have an input, you have an output, you are representing some function using the weights in the neural net. You can simplify that to a much more discrete system, and then you can end up with kind of a discrete idealization of a neural net in which you can much more explicitly see what happens when you do machine learning. And the main point is, what happens is it finds very complicated solutions to the problems that you're setting it. These are solutions that sort of happen to be wheeled in from the computational universe. They're computationally irreducible processes that just happen to fit the objective one wants. So anyway, there's lots of things I've been looking at. This is observer theory, which is a kind of an attempt to formalize the way that observers operate in our models of physics and beyond. Well, lots of things here about AI, about thermodynamics. There's not as much that I've kind of published recently about our physics project, and I'm hoping to change that this year. And I'm looking for lots of help in understanding things about limits of quantum computing, which I think are really something that can be explored with our models, looking at kind of ways to simulate quantum field theory, which again is something I think can be explored with our models, looking at extending things I've done in metamathematics. Well, I talked a bit about the way that you can make these networks of theorems. There are lots of kinds of things to study with that. And there are lots of ways. I mean, one of the things that I find important right now is from the fact that we started off studying physics. How do I get to this? Wow, that's weird. Yeah. We started off studying physics, made this kind of framework for studying fundamental physics. Now we can use that same framework to study metamathematics, to study biology, to study machine learning. Every time we bring in a new area, and there are a bunch of other areas as well, every time we bring in a new area, we both inform that area and we get to export things from that area back to the things that we're studying in fundamental physics. And that's been really useful and really helpful for understanding things. Anyway, I've yacked on for long enough here. If anybody wants to bring up anything, or if there's anything I should usefully chat about. You know, James here is representing our Wolfram Institute, which is a kind of a new construct. For me, I've been running our company for, 39 years now. And, you know, I think we've made a pretty good way of doing innovative research and development, building products, figuring things out about building products, and so on with our company. And kind of the goal is to take those same methodologies to science. And I think I've been rather productive in recent years, kind of figuring out things in science using those methodologies, both in terms of sort of the tools being used and the strategy for how to actually get things done. And kind of our goal with the Institute is to take those kinds of strategies for really figuring out exciting new things and apply them to science. And going well to begin with. We're certainly interested in expanding what we're doing. And as I say, this year, one of the areas, well, one area is infrageometry. That's kind of a pretty theoretical area. Another area is experimental implications of the physics project. There are also many, many applications, like one that I've been working on very recently is a formalized theory of medicine, which is something you don't expect to have a formalized theory of. But it turns out from some of these things, from multicomputation, from thinking about biology, it's really cool, actually. A lot of things that have sort of been anecdotal results about medical practice, you can kind of see sort of from a theoretical point of view why something like that would be true. And so those are things I've been exploring, and there are a whole bunch of areas where it seems that with the hammer of kind of this computational foundational approach, with that hammer, there are many nails that one can hit, so to speak.